Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending where you are. Welcome to the 2020 Biannual Conference of the Portuguese American Leadership Council of the United States. My name is João Pinto. I am the U.S. Director of AICEP, the Portuguese Trade and Investment Agency, and I will be moderating our panel this morning. First and foremost, I sincerely hope that you, your families, colleagues, and friends are doing well during these challenging times. For today's panel, Why Portugal? Investment Opportunities Abound, we have as our guest Mr. Luís Castro Henriques, Chairman of the Board and CEO of AICEP Portugal Global. Good afternoon, Mr. President. Luís, thank you for being here with us today.
Good afternoon, João. Thank you very much for this opportunity too. Thank you to all those attending. Thank you also for Lisa for helping us here. And I just hope, just as you mentioned, that everyone is doing well and their families too. These are different times, but I'm sure we'll surpass them. And I think, we can start by basically explaining what has been going on here in Portugal in these past few months. We've had a confinement period like most of the world, but we were able to thrive and adapt through that. So
yes, Luís, just before we start, for those less familiar with AICEP, let me just tell that AICEP is the Portuguese government business entity responsible for attracting and encouraging foreign direct investment into Portugal and to support the internationalization of the Portuguese companies by means of export activities or investment abroad. Before we get started, some quick housekeeping, which is very important. During this event, all the microphones will stay muted. However, towards the end of this panel, there will be an opportunity for a Q&A session in which all of you are invited and welcome to ask questions. If you want to place a question, you may do it so by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens. So let's get started, Luís. As you were saying, during these unprecedented times, it is inevitable to start our discussion with the COVID-19 pandemic and its economic and social impact. As it is happening with the rest of the world, Portugal has been getting its share of challenges. Can you please tell us what impact this pandemic has been having on the Portuguese economy, how the Portuguese companies have adapted to it, and what is the perspective for Portugal's economic performance in the coming months and in 2021?
Okay, João, thanks a lot. And thanks for introducing AICEP. So yes, our job is to bring further investment and raise the exports of the country. Basically, I think we need to separate this let's separate different types of activities. So obviously, Portugal has a relevant amount of dependence on tourism. This represents just a little bit below 10% of our GDP. So obviously, tourism in 2020 is an industry that suffered immensely. And I would basically put that aside for a while because obviously they have very, very specific conditions and the impact is huge on their activity in several levels, going from the airlines to the hotel business, everything. But apart from that, on the rest of the industry, the impacts are very, very asymmetric. So we've had, both companies that actually thrived during the confinement and the early days of the pandemic for obvious reasons. The pharma sector, the health sector, companies that were able to adapt the production for these protective equipments. We've had quite a few, and that represented significant business, especially in Europe, because you also had to supply the rest of Europe. We've also had companies that did very, very well in the agro food sector, because certain countries at the beginning of the confinement needed certain supplies and to make sure they had certain levels of food supplies in their own countries. And so some of our companies were actually able to export the same amount as they used to export for the rest of the year for those countries. So those were the positive effects. But in general, obviously stopping between 3 weeks and a month will have an impact. And some companies even stopped a bit more than that. So obviously there are companies that are suffering more from this impact. However, for the past 4 months, I've been visiting dozens and dozens of companies around the country, obviously exporting companies. And what we've seen is that companies that export and were strong exporters prior to the crisis have been doing fairly well. They'll have an impact that ranges from maintaining sales as in 2019, which was a fairly good year, to reductions that range from 2 to 3%. Then there are companies that have a higher dependence on the final consumer. Those will have an impact that almost reaches 10%. And then it's a very, very small universe. I'm speaking here for large exporting companies that have higher negative effects than this. However, obviously this impacts more companies that were less ready or had less of an exporting profile, and also companies that were less strong at the beginning of the confinement. So we still expect a reduction of GDP that will range from 7 to 10%. There are several estimates going on. We still don't know, but this should be the range of the reduction of our GDP. We expect a reduction of overall exports of around this value, eventually a little bit less, although current estimates are a bit higher than that. However, here I think that the year-end results will be a bit better than we expect, at least from the sample that I've been following and visiting in these past few months. There is an additional factor, is that this crisis for certain sectors will actually last a bit longer than just 2020. Several sectors will be affected and highly affected also in the first quarter, and let's say the first half of the second quarter of 2021. And why is that? Well, for a very, very simple reason. We have a large industry of garments, shoes, and textiles, and obviously stores closed for more than 3 months, at least in most of Europe and several countries around the world. And so that means that for those sectors that sell directly to the final consumer, through retail, those companies have the stock of 2020 that they still need to sell. And so I believe that in those sectors, they will still have a strong impact in early 2021. On the other hand, they're having almost a regular quarter in the last quarter of 2020. So let's see how this balances out. Obviously, there's a lot of support going on and a lot of financial support for the companies to keep up their activity and to stabilize their payments during this period. So I think, most of them will be able to resist the crisis and actually get ready to continue exporting. Because at the end of the day, we knew in early March 2020 that most Portuguese companies were competitive. They were thriving in the international markets. Our exports kept on growing at a higher rate than GDP. And also investment was doing very, very well. So, if you were competitive prior to the confinement, there is no reason not to be competitive after that. Obviously, companies that were less prepared or have a smaller scale or a smaller diversification will have a higher impact. But AICEP at the end is here to help them, and we'll try to do our best.
Very well. Quite interesting. What are your expectations for 2021? Should Portugal be growing at an estimated 2-3%, have a GDP growth of 2-3%, perhaps more? What's your view on that?
So the overall estimates, and here I'll speak of the sort of average of the institutions that make forecasts for Portugal. Mm-hmm. They basically say that we'll have this impact between 7 or 8 to 10% of GDP, and that the recovery in 2021 and 2022 will be something like 2/3 in 2021 and another third in 2022. And basically this would mean that early 2023, we would be back at the same level as in 2019. Now, the current estimate for 2021, the government just launched their estimates yesterday. They are about 5.4%, so which is obviously larger than the average growth that we've been having in the past few years. We cannot forget that we are highly exposed to Europe. Europe has been growing in the past 3 years or 4 years at around 1 to 1.5%, and Portugal, fortunately, has been growing significantly above this. However, Europe represents 75% of our exports. So if our client countries are growing at this rate, it's impossible for us to grow at the double-digit rate. So this is still the universe. However, in 2021, I believe that most of the countries will be recovering at the fastest pace, and so Portugal should be growing between this 5 to 6%. I think the IMF also gave out a forecast yesterday claiming that Portugal should be growing more than 6%. I think it's reasonable at this moment, from what we know, to assume this.
All right, very good. And I believe that one of the key aspects for this economic recovery will be the capacity of Portugal to keep attracting foreign direct investment. In this sense, could you tell us what are the main competitive advantages of Portugal?
Okay, so I'll try to give a two-part answer to that. First, the competitive advantages that Portugal had and Portugal has, and that hasn't changed, are pretty much, well, so first, talent. Most people do not associate Portugal to a highly talented country, but that's just the reality nowadays. We have 30,000 STEM students coming out into the market every year. In a 10 million people country, this is relevant. We've been receiving several significant investments, especially in the service sector, that really relies in this highly qualified young population that is coming into the market. Most of this population speaks several languages. So most students that finish their higher degrees on average speak at least 2 foreign languages. So that's common in Portugal. Most students will speak English just as I am doing now. So I hope that our audience can understand well what I'm saying. And so I'd say that's the main differentiating factor. Then there are other factors that obviously work well for Portugal. We have extensive and a great transport and telecommunications infrastructure. In this sense, let me mention, and this is very, very interesting, during the confinement period and during, obviously we still have a lot of people working from home rather than from the premises. We've had obviously a higher requirement from the network of more than 50%, and we basically had no trouble whatsoever. So this confirms the thesis that we've been defending, that Portugal has a great telecommunications infrastructure that can really sustain even high peak and high demand periods such as the one that we had. And this is pretty much pervasive all around the country. So you can set up business anywhere in the country and you'll have a good connection. And this is also an important factor. On top of that, we're also competitive. Well, obviously the main reason is you have full access to a very, very large market. I don't know if our friends in America have this perception, but nowadays doing business out of Berlin or out of Lisbon is exactly the same. The rules are the same. There's a completely level playing field for everybody. So you have full access to this market. This represents almost 500 million of fairly wealthy consumers. We are obviously a Euro country, so our currency is fully stabilized and is the main currency in Europe. And we have strong support for investment in Portugal, especially for large industrial deployments. We can give out supports up to 25% of CapEx costs, which is obviously a competitive factor. And finally, also, I imagine that at least those that have a Portuguese surname here in the audience might know this, but probably not the others. Portugal is considered one of the countries in the world with the highest quality of life. And here, let me break down into several factors. The first one, and the one that is actually mostly valued by companies, is that Portugal really is a stable country. According to the Global Peace Index, Portugal is the most peaceful country in Europe. This means that we're a country not only where it is safe to live, work, and move around, but also there is a stable and socioeconomic cohesion between the population. So there is no, let's say, fractures within the population. And we're also considered as a very, very low risk country in the world. Portugal is considered the third lowest risk country in the world, which obviously might be not exciting for the young students that want to come over here. But believe me, that's not a factor. I'll give you afterwards an argument for that. But it certainly is valuable for companies that want to establish and families that want to set up their lives here. And this is highly valued. We've been receiving more and more expats. Portugal currently ranks #1 in the world as expat destination. And obviously, you have a sunny country that you can enjoy, do sports all year round, and enjoy the ocean pretty much from anywhere in the country, as we have a very, very long coastline. Now, regarding investment during the pandemic, It was actually interesting. I mean, as you can imagine, at least during the last weeks of March and early weeks of April, pretty much the world stopped, and we were all busy trying to see how we could sort that out. However, and this is an interesting fact, during the period that goes until early May, we were able to bring 7 new clients to the country. Some of them started hiring remotely and have started their operations out of Portugal fully remotely. This has represented almost 1,000 new jobs created in Portugal with these new customers. Obviously, during this period, most of the customers were service sector customers. So we were talking of software development centers, shared service centers, and service operations that export out of Portugal. Once again, highly valuing this highly talented population, young population that we have that speaks several languages. And I always say this, I always ask, why do Portuguese youngsters speak so many languages? And obviously the easy answer is because we're a small country. But we could reply, well, but there are almost 300 million people speaking Portuguese around the world. So that could not be the case. And the true fact is, Portugal has been involved in this globalization business for quite a few hundred years. And so it's normal for us culturally to speak several languages because we do understand that we need to deal with others. And the best way to do that is actually to speak their own language. And that's why we are highly proficient in English, we're highly proficient in French, in Spanish, in German. And that's, I'd say, a base fact of our talent, which is highly valued by international investors. So even during the pandemic, we kept on doing business. Up till now, I can tell you that we've received several investments. Now, even in the past few months, we've also started receiving again industrial investments. So business hasn't stopped with the agency, and as long as myself and our team goes, it won't stop, and we'll keep on working on this and bringing new customers to the country.
Very good. And you have mentioned that talent is one of the differentiating factors of Portugal, mainly in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. One would assume that the information technology sector is a priority target for Portugal's FDI attraction efforts. Are there any foreign investment sectors besides information technology that Portugal specifically targets?
Yes, several. So first, and I think this is important when I describe the agency's approach, the agency does not have a prescriptive approach. So we're open to any investment. We obviously evaluate the type of investment, even for incentive purposes. However, we do understand that there are certain segments where we're highly competitive and we've been able to bring investment against other locations that compete with the best in the world. And obviously, software development is one of them. We've received significant American investment in the past few years in that sector. And Portuguese talent has been identified as a top factor. And here I'm talking of thriving Silicon Valley companies, financial companies based out of the East Coast, but also German industrial companies, French industrial companies that set up their software development centers and their IT centers and the R&D centers out of Portugal. But also, and this is actually interesting, some of them even start with shared service centers and then move on to software development centers because they really understand that we're highly talented for that. Now, this isn't the service sector. And you're asking me, are there other sectors that we target? Yes, we target the automotive sector. Portugal has been receiving a lot of investment from the automotive sector in the past 5 years. We also target certain industrial subsegments, but also the life sciences, ranging from the R&D, but also to the production. We target the aeronautical sector, and we've been fairly successful in the past few years. Obviously, they're having quite a tough moment at the moment, but look, we'll all go back to normal sooner or later. So, and this is a differentiating factor. So Portugal has been receiving strong aeronautical investments in the past few years, and I think that will keep on going on. I can even claim that I think that by year end we'll even have another aeronautical investment, small investment, but it will keep on moving. And so yes, we target the sweet spot for investing in Portugal, whether it is in industry or in service sector, it really is this higher value added activity that requires people with higher training, even technical training. We're not only speaking of college degree people, we're also speaking of people that have technical advanced training, and also companies that need to interact with several subunits within their global companies. Those companies have been systematically choosing Portugal, and this ranges from top German, French, American, Spanish companies that decided to move a relevant amount of their operations to Portugal. And so these are our main targets. It's productions and services where there is clearly a higher value add.
Yes, and you mentioned some recent US investment in Portugal. Could you give us examples of some companies that have invested in Portugal, either in the information technology sector or others? Some recent examples?
Well, yeah, so I can actually give you a figure, but I cannot disclose the name of the companies because the agency's approach is that companies speak for their investments. Obviously, we're here to support them, but they are the ones that manage the PR of their own investments. But just to give you an idea, during this period, so in 2020, we've received 3 investments from America. But I can claim, in the past few years, in the past 2 years, several significant investments. For instance, we're speaking software development. We have a small but growing very, very fast company such as Cloudflare from Silicon Valley that moved into Portugal. They opened their second location in Europe in Portugal after London. But we also have huge companies like Cisco, like Google, like Microsoft that have been investing heavily in the country and have kept on growing their operations out of Portugal. Most of them are advanced services or advanced software development out of Portugal. Probably I'd say even the best example is Cloudflare, a hugely competitive company that provides services to some of the best software companies and web companies in the world. So they only hire top tier talent, and they really chose Portugal because they saw that they could set up their operation close to university where they can make this direct contact with top talent and their hiring team.
Yes. Let's switch now a little bit and let's talk about the pandemic and some of the effects that is having on the foreign direct investment. And I believe that an important aspect to take into consideration as a direct effect of this pandemic are the disruptions in the supply chains, which have created the new trend or tendency of companies to reshore or nearshoring, right? Mm-hmm. Does AICEP have any policies in place to try to capitalize on this tendency, on this trend? And do you already have any examples, investment examples of companies that are thinking about moving to Portugal because of this reshoring or nearshoring tendencies?
Well, here I'll speak more of facts than of policy. So yes, we've been receiving, but this was actually going already on prior to the confinement, and I think it's important for our audience to understand this. I'll give you an example, and this was their own CEO that claimed this, so I'm just quoting him. We've received strong investment by Airbus in late 2019 here in the north of Portugal, and their point was exactly that their proximity to France and Germany, the stability of the country, really ensure them that their value chain would have no disruption under any circumstance. And believe me, at that time, they weren't even expecting that COVID-19 would show up. So this was already something that we're seeing in 2 main sectors. The aeronautical sector is a very, very good case in the industrial arena, but also on the nearshoring of certain services and certain software development centers. They were clearly focused on being closer to the decision centers and ensuring they were on the same time zone and that they were not on the other side of the world. Now, this means that I think and especially now after COVID-19, no sensible executive will take a decision not considering the safety of their supply chain. And this is a new reality. Although I think many of them are already thinking about this, now it's something that is unsurpassable. They really have to incorporate that in their own decision. And in that sense, Portugal being, fully within Europe, but also being the first country on the other side of the Atlantic for America, is a safe destination and a close destination for their value chain. I mean, one border that never has any issues is actually our Atlantic border. It's always open and has always kept on working. And so this is a reality that obviously we have to take into account because it's a reality of our own customers. In that sense, during the confinement, we reviewed our strategy, our investment strategy, and what we saw was that the main macro tendencies, macro trends that we had identified, some of them had accelerated significantly. One of them was actually this nearshoring movement and this closeness or next-shoring movement going on both in industry and the service sector. But the other one was also the capability of operating in a stable and safe environment, and that was a key factor also to choose Portugal. The other thing is there are other macro trends where Portugal is fairly strong. I mean, if you want, and if your company values sustainable development, Portugal is one of the countries that has the largest share in Europe of green energy production. And we're very, very attentive to that and very, very competitive in that arena. So some of these macro trends basically were accelerated and we reviewed. But again, as I say, we're not prescriptive. Obviously, we focused on the sectors where we believe that we'll be able to attract more customers, but we're not fully prescriptive. So if you want to consider Portugal as an investment destination, reach out to us and we'll be more than delighted to evaluate the project with you. I hope that fully answered that. There's another aspect you were telling me, were there companies that made the decision? So I refer this Airbus, Thalia, their decision, but I can also give you a couple of other examples, even closely here from Germany or France. We have industrial companies in the automotive sector that decided to be in Portugal, again, because of the sustainability and ensuring their just-in-time productions in Central Europe, but also around Europe. And Portugal is a good destination for that. We've had recently a large German company that decided that they would produce all of their supplies, for instance, in wind turbine blades, out of Portugal, again, due to a nearshoring movement and a safety of supply movement. So yes, I'm seeing already that trend within our customers, and we obviously need to adapt to that, and we're working clearly not only with our current customers but with prospective customers that can really benefit from having here probably I'd say an onshore and close location such as Portugal.
All right, very well. So before we go into our Q&A session, one very important question. Luís, during these times of economic slowdown, FDI incentives are an even more important aspect for foreign investors when deciding where to invest. Could you please tell us what are the current FDI incentives that Portugal offers, and are these incentives going to remain the same during the upcoming 2030 European Union framework?
So the direct answer is yes, we have incentives. So we support R&D operations up to 50% of their OPEX costs. We support 75% of the cost of universities that support those projects. So that support, and supply and service the company's projects. We give out support up to 25% of CapEx costs in Portugal, especially in new factories, but also in relevant and innovative developments for current customers here. And our expectation is that in the next 2 years, this will remain the same because we will be using what we call transition money, which is the money that moves between two periods of European frameworks. Now, in the meantime, we'll also be receiving the recovery fund support, and that I think will also strengthen other areas, especially those that want to solidify their circular economy investments, their environmental transition investments, but also their digitization investments. So there we're still awaiting for the final decision from the European Commission. This is a decision that involves obviously 27 countries. So it takes a bit longer than in the US. However, our expectation is that early in 2021, we'll be able to frame that out and start rolling it out during 2021. Now, regarding the future period of European framework, we do already know that certain type of activities for large companies might not be fully supported as they were in the past. However, that's still under discussion, and probably it's still a bit early to really, define the lines of support that we have for that. What I think is that entrepreneurs and investors, at least until 2024, and I'd say even 2025, have a clear notion that, innovative projects, and especially projects that will foster the digital transition, environmental sustainability, and the circular economy, which obviously is also tied to environmental sustainability, but is a different business, will have their projects supported by the agency. The other thing is we have a clear notion that R&D support for R&D centers, such as the investments that we have by some American companies, but also by German and French companies here, that will remain in the long term. That's our perspective. So those supports, I was saying that we support up to 50% of OPEX, which, to be very practical and straightforward with our audience, usually companies are able to have something ranging between 34 and 37% of support, plus the 75% support for the university work that is done for them. That will remain on the long term. So I think that especially companies wanting to develop R&D centers out of Portugal, they can clearly come here with a long-term perspective on obtaining support.
Very, very quite interesting. Okay, let's move on to our Q&A session, and we have a few questions. I'll start actually with a question that our ambassador, Domingos Fezes Vital, just wrote, and quite important. And the question is, how do you see the role of the Portuguese American community in the promotion of trade and investment in Portugal?
Okay, so first, Domingos, thank you very much for the question to our ambassador, and thanks for being here with us. This is obviously very, very relevant. I mean, the first aspect, and I'm also speaking here to the Luso and Portuguese American community that's listening to us here, do not forget that the first impact on notoriety on American investors most probably will come from you. The first perspective they'll have on the country will be based on the dealings they have with you and the dealings they have with the Portuguese American community. So in terms of notoriety effect, this is obviously relevant. The other aspect is also in terms of access. Obviously, we've been dealing a lot with our community back in the US, and they also provide several and very, very interesting insights to us. The final aspect is some of them are able to bring investments to Portugal and to signalize investments, and some of them are even also investors here in Portugal, so that's relevant. There is even a status for diaspora investors in Portugal, so those that have been abroad for more than 2 years can have a special status and have an additional support for investments, especially in the interior of the country, which also matches some of their geographical origin sometimes. And so, yes, this is relevant, this is important, and obviously we'll continue working with the community, and João, Teresa, and Olga, and the whole team will continue that for sure. Thank you, Domingos.
All right, another very interesting question, this coming from Jerry Zatten. I expect that first-time foreign investors into Portugal look to Lisbon. Are there other growth centers?
Yes. So the two main GDP generating centers in Portugal are obviously Lisbon and Porto. To give here an American perspective, because obviously you're used to a country that is almost as big as a continent, at least from a Portuguese perspective. So Lisbon and Porto are separated by 300 kilometers, which I imagine something like 200 miles. So they're not very far away, but these are the the two main spots, two main cities of the country. Now, a large share and the largest share of industry is actually located around Porto. So Lisbon is more of a service city. There is a large industrial platform on the south bank of the city that then goes on for several kilometers. But I would say, this really is more than Lisbon and Porto. And I'll give you the recent example of the service sector and the software development arena. So we've been expanding immensely towards Braga. So for those that know the country, Braga is really on the top north of the country. And now we are seeing some of these companies moving from Porto Braga, starting to go down to Aveiro and other locations. So very, very large operations usually choose Lisbon because of the sheer size of the city. Smaller operations tend to choose the north of Portugal because also that gives them access to a higher variety and higher diversity of supply of talent. So yes, we've been seeing this movement going on across the country. In industrial terms, it's actually a different factor. So this is for really those that know the geography of the country. So Portugal is like a rectangle, okay, without the islands, so without the Azores and Madeira. So the continent is basically a long rectangle. And what we've seen in industrial terms is that it is exactly like a cross that starts in Lisbon and finishes in the northern border of Spain. And then halfway through Aveiro, Coimbra, Viseu, has this big industrial mark. We have car producing facilities just below Lisbon, but also near Viseu. We have a lot of even new investment from components companies in the interior of the country around the area. And then we have a lot of highly sophisticated investors that have installed themselves between Porto and Braga, which is, Porto and Braga are probably even closer than New York and New Jersey, but here in Portugal, they're different cities, or very, very different cities, okay?
All right, very well. So now we have a question actually coming from Luís Tormenta, and this actually is kind of interesting. Yes, can you please speak to the availability of business brokers in Portugal that can connect investors outside Portugal with existing operating companies that require capital?
Okay, so two things. This is obviously a relationship between private parties. So here AICEP facilitates contacts, but does not delve into that. That has to be sorted out between the private parties. What I can say is that in the past few years, we've been having more and more PE funds operating out of Portugal. Some of them, I'd say, with a Portuguese DNA, but some others, even American outfits that have been here in Portugal, have been establishing some activity over here. And I think that already facilitates some contact and some sort of perspective vision on companies that need further capital to grow, and companies that are highly competitive, have strong positive results, but basically need a strong influx of capital to go from 10 million euros in sales to 100 million euros in sales. So that is a market that is growing significantly. On top of that, I'd say that there are also companies that have been putting themselves out on the market, especially when they're expanding abroad. And that would be a good way to start establishing contact with them. But I have to admit, we don't have many institutionalized brokers in Portugal doing that. So, replying directly to the question, we have a small and limited number of investment banks operating in Portugal. Again, mostly due to the scale of the country. But also, this is something that, collapsed after the 2011 crisis. But there are a few operators. Obviously, AICEP, if you are based in America, you can get in touch with João or Teresa if you are on the West Coast, or Olga, and we can give you the contacts of these investment brokers, of these small investment banks that operate out of Portugal. But we can also give you contacts of PE funds that operate in Portugal and that are also looking for capital for their own funds to invest in companies that they have already targeted. Now, the pure, and I understand this in New York, this is very frequent. These pure brokers, we don't have a lot of them. So there's here probably an opportunity for those in the audience.
Yes, another question, and now let's move into the agro industry sector. And the question comes from Carolina Chayo, and basically she asks if, can you please discuss regulatory framework for investment in the agro-industrial sector in Alentejo? So someone looking to invest in Alentejo in the agro industry.
Well, actually, that's an area where we've had some American investments, people developing almonds, but also olive oil and other nuts. The regulatory setting is a very, very simple one. You're free to invest and come over to the country, and we're more than happy to receive American investment. So this is the overall setting, so good news. Now, the other good news is Portugal, and why is the Alentejo becoming so interesting, especially for these large-scale agricultural developers? Well, first, it has a very, very similar climate to California. So those that have been doing very, very well in California will certainly be able to set up operation easily in the Alentejo region. The other thing, and this is probably the differentiating factor towards California nowadays, is that we decided 40 years ago, and it took quite a while to get the investment going, but Portugal developed the largest artificial lake in Europe in the Alentejo region. And the main purpose of that was actually to have an irrigation system that would irrigate the whole of the Alentejo in the south of Portugal. This obviously changes the profile of culture and the profile of intensity of production out of the Alentejo. And it's exactly that opportunity that some of these large players, large agro players have been investing in Portugal. But we're also a leading country producing concentrated tomato paste. We're also a leading country producing certain types of vegetables. And so it all depends on your know-how. If you know a lot about olive oil, if you know a lot about vegetables or fruits, I'm certainly sure that you'll be able to find a location to produce that competitively and not only feeding the Portuguese market, but above all, export to the European market and also back to America. The agro sector has been very, very successful in the past few years in increasing their exports. And definitely the Alentejo region has this competitive edge nowadays with a supply of water, which is very, very relevant. So all in all, the regulatory setting is this. You have a full irrigation infrastructure that is already up and running in most of the locations of Alentejo. This is still expanding through the south, but I would say most of the main locations are already have access to this irrigation system. And on top of that, there are no other barriers. American investors are more than welcome to come over. There are already other cases. And we really look forward to have, more and good competitive agro-food producers out of Portugal. And I'm sure that there are a lot of American companies that are able to take advantage of that to supply not only the European market, but also other areas of the world that can supply out of Portugal, including America.
Yes, great. So now we have another question from Manuel Valerio. Okay. And basically, he wants to know what is the significance of Madeira Islands in the Portuguese economy and how is AICEP promoting greater business and trade opportunities between Madeira and other nations?
Okay, so we work with the Madeira region just like with the Azores region. So they have their own agencies, and what we do is we operate directly in partnership with them. Obviously, any trade promotion activities that we have, if they include products and segments that are of interest for producers from Madeira, they're included in that. So we are the national agency for that purpose. Obviously, investors that come over here and might have a competitive advantage being based out of Madeira or the Azores, we send them over to them, and we've been doing that in certain specific cases where those locations were very competitive for what they were doing. And so, yes, we have a close relationship, and Madeira, just like the rest of the continent, is promoted However, our operation is not with boots on the ground. We do have a partnership with the local agency, and we work closely with them. I have biannual meetings with those agencies every year to coordinate our actions and tasks, and we have a direct contact on a daily basis within our teams.
All right, great. So I'm going to ask one last question, since we don't have questions from our audience, and I think this is very relevant. And I would like you to talk a little bit about the new campaign that AICEP launched and that we are about to launch in the US, the Portugal Open for Business campaign. If you could very briefly explain what is this campaign about and the purpose, and why are we doing this campaign, and in this case, in the US and Canada, the Portugal Open for Business campaign.
Well, the purpose of the campaign was actually initially a very, very simple one. It became more complex and more broad-ranging across time. So what we wanted was our customers, especially those that knew the country, to understand, late May, early June, that Portugal was open for business. And that meant several things. First, our industrial production was working on full steam, obviously with some of the restrictions that the pandemic obliges you to have in terms of distance in workplaces and all that. But at the end of the day, everything was back to normal. The second thing was also to show, how quickly some Portuguese companies adapted. The best example that I have is this protective equipment that, basically was not produced at all in Europe. And suddenly in less than a month or 2 months, several Portuguese companies were able to become producers that adapted their productions. We even had, facilities and factories that were set up in 2 months from scratch to produce that in surgical gloves, in masks. And for us, this represented a sense of vitality and of desire to thrive under any circumstance. And this was the objective of the Portugal Open for Business campaign, which is, look, within the current setting, everything is as normal as possible. We kept on working and we won't stop. That's the Portuguese way to do it. Now, then it became also an opportunity to give out other examples of adaptation or further activity, even within the pandemic, obviously, because we noticed, and I think we all realized that by now, but in April, this wasn't very, very obvious, that this was something that was going to last actually a bit longer. And so we've been diversifying the type of examples that we've been putting out in the social media. We've been broadening the sectors that we want to showcase, but above all, two simple messages. First, we're open for business, so it really is working and business as usual. And secondly, it is also an opportunity to provide, again, a notion of how innovative Portuguese or foreign investors in Portugal can be and how competitive they are for their production around the world. And so this is what we hope from this campaign. We'll also be doing in the next few weeks another campaign showing some infographic information regarding the competitive factors of Portugal, which you can find in the presentation that João Mota Pinto will be distributing after this session. And so I hope that is useful for you to understand how competitive Portugal is. I know that Portugal, as a small country seen from the US, might not always be, top of mind for an investment location. However, Portugal is very competitive. We have astonishing talent, great infrastructure. It's easy to do business over here. You'll find people that will speak English everywhere. Actually, one of the main complaints we have from the expats is that some of them want to learn Portuguese and they can't because all the Portuguese reply to them in English. So they lack the opportunity to learn Portuguese. But that's the reality. Your kids can walk to school. It's extremely safe. You can have dinner al fresco anywhere without any trouble. And this is a set of competitive factors that I'm sure that you value for your investments. Thank you, João.
So we're coming to an end. Just one last question: is there any other point you'd like to mention that we haven't covered in today's panel? One last message.
Yes, probably I'll try by finishing this because I think it's important I see that some of our audience are people that are already attentive to Portugal and following the reality in Portugal. I believe that the next 3 to 6 months will be very, very tough on the economy. And this is interesting. It will be tougher on a social basis rather than on a financial basis. And why is that? Because some of the companies were probably not that well prepared prior to the crisis, and they might have some difficulty going through this moment. But above all, the tourism sector has been highly impacted, and that represents a lot of jobs. Now, this is important. So when you see these figures going on negatively in the next few months, this is normal. Actually, what we are trying to do is actually to take this as an advantage to train, to digitize most of these people and actually train them to participate in other sectors. But the next few months will be tough. However, I believe that recovery after that will continue. I also believe that, just like I said, we've been receiving several investments in the past few months, even under confinement, that will continue. 2020 will be, I'd say, an average year, probably not a great year like the 2 record years we had in the year before. But look, like anything in life, the year hasn't ended, and we're working strong to make sure that we go as further as possible. So who knows, we might even bring a good result back home. That in investment terms. In terms of exports, I think that we'll finish the year, again, as I mentioned, Portugal open for business, everything working. The first quarter will have a fairly strong impact on certain sectors. And by the end of second quarter, I think this will be going really back to normal. So here it really is where you see the asymmetric effect to the different industries of the COVID-19 crisis. I hope this clarified and at least will help out the analysis of some of the figures that people will be reading in the next few months, but also will enable them to understand that some of the figures are not paradoxes. They are the reality that we have at the moment, but we're fully ready and working hard to basically go back as soon as possible to the 1st of March of 2020, where we're very competitive in terms of investment and growing solidly our exports.
Yes.
Thank you, João.
I certainly hope so, and hopefully we'll have a speedy recovery and everything will get back to normal very soon. So basically, I would like to thank our audience for being here with us today, and in particular, I would like to thank you, our guest speaker. Thank you, Luís.
Well, thank you, João.
If you have any questions, please email them to me. My email is joão.pinto@portugalglobal.pt. There is joao.pinto@portugalglobal, again, one word, .pt, and we'll make sure we'll get your questions answered. And basically, have a rest of a wonderful day and stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, João. Thank you, Lisa. And thank you to everybody for your time.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your time,
Safe.
for your dedication to PALCUS. Have a good afternoon and evening.
Thanks a lot, and keep safe, please.
All
the best. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.